Are we beginning at 1625?
I think it's 16. Beginning at the first verse of
Oh, the
16.
first verse.
Yeah.
That's what I had marked.
Oh,
That's what I wrote down.
Okay, good.
okay, yeah, I have 16.
If I don't write it down, I can't remember.
Yeah, me too.
My memory's not that.
A new participant.
All right. Hello, how you doing, Jim?
I'm doing great, yourself.
Yeah. All right, I think we're going live on YouTube. We're waiting to do that. So let's go ahead and begin with prayer. And welcome to everybody. I think we're a little bit in our summer slowdown, so that's okay. We'll carry on with the folks who are with us. Let us pray. Holy and loving God, we give you thanks for this day, for this community, for the opportunity to gather around Scripture, to read and ask questions, and through your Holy Spirit to learn what you would have us learn. Pray that this day would be a continuation of that learning process. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So a few folks have joined with us. We're at chapter 16, the beginning of 16, and with God's help, I'm going to try and get through 19, but we'll see how we do. Chapter 25 is our last chapter that we want to finish. And I may not go verse by verse as much, especially with 16. I may give you a bit of a summary. But before I get started, any questions or comments from anyone here in person or online? All right. What I'm going to start with is a map, and it's a different map from what I've been showing. Hopefully I got the right one. Let's see. Got it. Not sure if that's going to be right or not. Try again. Let's see. Map of the Syria. Perfect. Now we got it. So I don't know how many of you know from your high school or maybe college history class about Assyria. You hear about it in the Bible some, in the book of Jonah, and some other places where it's talked about. It was really the first great world empire. China and Egypt were two great empires, but they pretty much stayed within their, they grew from their borders, but where there's a continuity of culture and language. More so, not perfectly, but Assyria really spread out over a wide area in what we think of as the Middle East, the Near East. And if you can see the map okay, this color of green, I guess you call it a darker green, is kind of the original boundaries up through the 9th century, right before what happens in chapter 17 with Samaria. But you can see it spreads all the way from the Mediterranean. What we think of now as kind of part of Turkey, definitely Syria, then east into areas that we think of as today as Iraq or Iran and so forth. So it's a pretty broad arc. It goes through a lot of the Mesopotamian circle, what was called the Fertile Crescent, but that part of the Middle East that was very much kind of the birthplace of empire. But if you come down to around the time when the war is going to come into Judah, in addition to what has happened in Samaria, you can see how it spread even more widely, kind of the peak of the Assyrian Empire. So it had certain, vassal states that would do what they want, so they didn't take the time or energy to defeat them or take them on in battle. But then there'd be certain territories where the king either wouldn't cooperate or they were trying to make an example. And so they would conquer them or take them on in battle. So we'll read some about that today. But what is unique about Assyria is they did a lot of, I guess, what we would call terroristic type military strategy. So and you'll hear this in chapter 18 and following, they would come and say, we're going to, all these bad things we're going to do to you if you don't surrender. And so that was intentional, and then they would follow through. So for those cities, capitals of kingdoms that resisted, they would wipe them out and be very violent in what they would do. And then that would be part of their reputation as a military power. You don't want to mess with Assyria. So either pay them what they want as some type of tribute, or surrender quickly, because they're going to, do awful things if you don't. So again, hope that helps some with, you can see some of the other parts, what we would think of as Lebanon, but coming up, what would be called Phoenicia, where my cursor is, Damascus, we know today, the same city, basically, is as Syria, no S in front of it. But that was, Ammon was one of the kingdoms. So there are all these kingdoms that Judah and Israel or Samaria would fight and go back and forth with. But the 800-pound gorilla was definitely Assyria. And then over time, we'll get to this eventually, Assyria has their day and then they're done, like most great empires. So they're not going to be a power forever. So any questions about that, about Assyria?
What year, excuse me, what year did you say that was?
Okay, that's a good question. The dark green is around 824 BC. So the 9th century, remember, it counts down to the time of Christ, counts up after. So in our calendar, almost 3,000 years ago, 2,900 years ago or so. And then the lighter green, and my color description may not be quite right, but the bigger territory is them right about 100 years or so before they conquered Judah. So again, you can see Judah is pretty much surrounded, and we'll get to that later, not today. But you can see that Assyria's influence is all over the place, and that the kingdom of Egypt, which had been a great power but had declined, eventually will be conquered by Assyria, be defeated in battle. Any other questions about Assyria? Okay. So in chapter 16, we get a little bit of what I just described at a big, level, is what are the, how is this affecting Israel? And so remember, the Deuteronomistic history, these books, especially Kings, are written to explain what's going on from that theological point of view, that these things that are happening are because of God's either judgment or God's blessing based on how faithful the people of Israel and Judah are or have been. And remember, from this point of view, the person writing these chronicles, these theological treatises, nothing Israel can do is ever going to be totally righteous because they divided from the Davidic kingdom. So they're, from the start, they're kind of a bad seed, a bad apple. They're always going to be off. And then it varies. Some kings of Israel are really bad, like Ahab, and some are just moderately bad. But the main things they do, they don't worship at Jerusalem, at the temple. They have kind of a synchronistic type of religious worship. They worship in places, sometimes just out in the country, but in certain temples that had some history to why they were, why people worshiped there, but was contrary to that consolidation into Jerusalem. So that's Israel. And so what we're going to read, 16 and 17, is going to be kind of the climax of what happens because of Israel's sin. Their initial rebellion from the house of David, and then all the things following, that this was inevitable. And again, the Deuteronomistic history is written not really so much for Israel's benefit, Samaria's benefit, but for the benefit of Judah. Because again, it's written probably many centuries after the events described, kind of as a retrospective for Judah to learn, or perhaps even during the exile, to say, here's what happened back then because of these reasons, and this is what Judah, those who are still faithful, need to learn from the story, if that makes sense. So any questions about that or things to clarify in what I'm saying? Okay, so let's go to the text. So chapter 16, verse 1. I'm having trouble with this. Okay. 10. All right. So the beginning, King Ahaz is a bad king. Now he is a king of Judah. This is a reminder. So whereas all the kings of Israel are kind of bad just from the root, King Ahaz ends a string of 4 righteous kings. So Judah had had this run of good kings who had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord. None of them were completely right. Remember, they tended to keep the high places, which is the worship out in the country, because it was just a very popular cultic practice. But Ahaz not only was a bad king, he worked to undo all the good that had been done by these prior kings. So he did things. He restored the high places. So, there have been, or not the high places, he restored the worship of Baal. The high places had always continued. And he even did more than that. He made his son, this may be a figure of speech, symbolic, but made his son pass through fire. So we don't know exactly, but it seems that would be a regional god of Molech. And it would be if not a human sacrifice, symbolically a sacrifice of offering to God the king's son, which would have this huge religious significance because it was such a huge sacrifice. But they did other abominable practices, as described in verse 3, that were similar to what the people that God had driven out for the people of Israel kind of went back to those bad practices. So that was what he did religiously. And then he also had a threat, a military threat from King Rezin of Aram, verse 5 and following, and King Pekah. So there was this ongoing war that was taking place. But Ahaz, let's see, in the back and forth between King Rezin of Aram, they could not, and with the king of Israel fighting against Judah, they were going back and forth. It was kind of a stalemate to some degree. But during that time fighting in Aram, Edom rebelled. So, as a king in Judah, they're fighting on both fronts, I guess you would say. And so what he decides is to bring in a superpower. Remember the Cold War time with the U.S. and the Soviet Union, some of the smaller countries would play one against the other. Well, that's, I think, a fair analogy. So he calls to Assyria to help him with these battles that are too much for him or where he's not able to get victory. And basically says in verse 7, Ahaz sends messengers to this king, I won't even try to pronounce it, and says, I am your servant and your son, come and rescue me. And so basically make an alliance with me. And so Assyria, which I'm sure was a very calculating, powerful kingdom, agrees. And so he takes the tribute that is paid from Ahaz and uses that as, kind of a down payment for their new vassal master relationship. And what Assyria does, he does attack Damascus, so the capital of Aram, and defeats them. So this opponent of Judah is defeated. And so, of course, the king of Judah is happy. And remember, he's a bad king. He goes and he meets with the king of Assyria, and he kind of sees the altar at Damascus where he has built this victory altar and is very impressed. He says, boy, I like how you worship. Well, if you're the king of Judah, that's a problem because you're, of course, committed to worshiping Yahweh at the temple in Jerusalem. But what he does is he gives direction to his priest in verse 11 and basically says, I want something like this type of altar, this way of worshiping. And so they did that. And so they made this new altar, and then the old altar in verse 14. So that was the one designed, described earlier in Kings when Solomon was building the temple. He takes that off to the side, and instead of its prominent central place is off to the side, and was kind of like a king's personal altar, which was not the plan in the original design. And on this new altar, then that's where the sacrifices would take place. And so that would include the way that it was the practice of how the sacrifices were done, but with this different type of altar and kind of, again, a synchronistic worship. So worshiping Yahweh, but not according to the way Yahweh had designed the temple and the altar. And then in verse 17 and following, it says he kind of, depending how you want to describe it, he cuts back, he desecrates, you could say, some of the details of the temple. If you remember all the details of all the things that were included and how they were designed, he takes out the bath, he takes out all the figures that support that, the ornamental parts. And he instead, he uses those for other purposes. And he did this, verse 18. He did all these things at the end of verse 18 because of the king of Assyria. So again, as his master, as opposed to Yahweh being his master, he's doing what he thinks will please the king of Assyria. And then that summary, like they use in the transition from one king to another, verse 19 says the rest of the things he did is written in the annals of the kings of Judah. He slept with his ancestors, he was buried, and then Hezekiah succeeds him. So that's going to be some good news. So it's like 4 good kings, a really bad king, a really good king. So, there's back and forth. So that's 16 very quickly, but let me stop for a minute. Any questions about what I covered or any of the details? Or any comments? One thing the commentators say is there's not a whole lot of interpretation. A lot of the kings, you kind of get that Deuteronomistic worldview, and this seems a little more like a news report. Here's what happened and why. And especially even though Ahaz did some really bad things, I would say, and I gave you that perspective, kind of changing the way things were organized in the temple, there's not a whole lot of commentary. Even by this, the author of 2 Kings, you would think, other than saying he was a bad king, there wasn't a lot of commentary on that. So any thoughts about that?
It's a chronology more than anything else.
Correct. Yeah. So Judy says it's like a chronology. So it is. It's like, here's what happened. Not a lot of interpretation. That's right.
Well, it could be that the message has actually been getting across all along, and the readers and the writer don't have to go deeply into it. They're getting the gist. Good kings, bad kings, those that follow Yahweh, good, those that don't, have bad things happen. And I think everybody's getting bored by this point. So let's just whip it along.
All right. Well, hopefully that doesn't include us, but yeah, that's
No,
fair point.
not us, never us. That was a great summary.
I'm only as good as my material. Usually I have good material. Let's keep going then, unless there's a hot question, and go into chapter 17. In chapter 17, you're going to get the end of the northern kingdoms. So remember, with Jeroboam splitting from Rehoboam, who's the son of Solomon, from that point forward, you have these 2 camps. Israel is bigger in some sense, so there's a sense that has more power, though they fight back and forth. Judah and Israel, they're allies at times, but more often Israel would team up with one of the surrounding nations to go after Judah. Judah was probably richer, or maybe at least with Jerusalem well positioned. So, it's normal kind of intersectional or interregional warfare between 2 very close, really these same people in different regions. So in chapter 17, Hoshea is going to be the very last king of the northern kingdoms of Israel. So in the 12th year of King Ahaz of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned for 9 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, not like the kings of Israel who were before him. So what's interesting, though everything comes to a climax with Hoshea, he is not the worst. So Ahab and others were much worse, but he happened to be the one at the end where the culmination of all that's been unfaithful or sinful or rebellious, whatever word we want to use, it comes to a head with him. And so the king of Assyria came up against him. Hoshea became his vassal. So again, that was a common practice. Like I said earlier, paid tribute. The king of Israel, though, found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to King So of Egypt. I like King So because it's the easiest king to pronounce. And he said so. But he offered no tribute. So he was trying to play the game of the smaller kingdoms. So Egypt against Assyria. Egypt was less powerful now, but still powerful enough to be perhaps an alternative. And so the king of Assyria captures the king, Hoshea, imprisons him. So, that's obviously not a good sign. And then it says it pretty quickly. All that culminates. The king of Assyria, in verse 5, invaded the land, came to Samaria, and he besieged it. It was a 3-year siege. So, again, if you've seen the movies or read the history, sieges that long are horrible, terrifying for the people inside and lead to atrocities. So in the 9th year, so the king's captured. The 9th year of King Hoshea, Assyria captures Samaria, so it falls. Samaria is like the capital, the equivalent of Jerusalem. And different from the stories we're going to hear in Judah, he carries everybody away. Now, this is a strategy, a tactic that Assyria does. And the basic reasoning is you take people out of their home country and move them to another part of this vast empire. And then you take people from another part of this vast empire and bring them to their country. And the idea is you kind of disorient the people. So, if they're still in their homeland, even though they've been defeated and they're not as strong, they can do things to fight against the empire, guerrilla tactics, we would say maybe in more modern language. And so that was something Assyria did in many places. So and that's historically proven. That's a thing that happens. He places them in kind of the eastern part, so as far away from Samaria as he can get. And then he takes people from those areas and brings them in into what we would think is the northern part of Palestine. And this occurred, the summary, so this is again the Deuteronomistic interpretation in verse 7. This happened because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, and all that God had done for them, and they worshiped other gods. So that's kind of the root sin. And remember, they had the 2 calves. So in these 2 places of worship, Jeroboam set up idols. And so like in the Moses story, there are these calves that they worshiped. And they, again, worshiped Yahweh, but in a way that combined it with other gods. They walked in the customs of the nations before them. So that's all a summary. They did things, a lot of bad things. So these next several verses is all that they did in terms of their idolatrous worship. And so this is, again, kind of the coming of the judgment, not because of anything recently, but the accumulation. And when God in verse 12 says you don't do these things, that goes to the 10 Commandments, that they didn't listen, that the Lord sent prophets and they said, don't do this, turn from your evil ways. In verse 13, keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with the law. And, again, they did this. Again, the people didn't listen. So it's not just evil kings. There's really a sense of all the people are responsible for this judgment. So they despised the commandments. They went after false gods. They did everything they're not supposed to do. And if you read in the prophets, the prophetic literature in the Old Testament, or if you read even in the Gospels, there's stories that Jesus tells that kind of has echoes of this. The stories about the vineyard, that he sends, people to collect what is due to the king or the landlord to collect what's due to him, and they mistreat those people. They don't listen. So Jesus and the other prophets take from this part or contributed to how this was written, especially the prophets, that this was a pattern of not obeying. So again, the 2 calves that we talked about in verse 16, they made their sons and daughters pass through fire. So again, that repetition, they used divination and augury, so ways to learn, what to do other than in trusting God. So all these things, the Lord was angry. And in a sense, this implies Assyria is acting on God's behalf. That'll be one of the strange things, that either through their words or their actions, it seems God uses these non-Israelite or non-Judean kings. So that kind of continues there. Judah also. So, all this bad stuff happens in Israel. Judah also did not keep the commandments. And so there was that both and. But Judah had enough good kings and enough faithfulness to what Yahweh or the Lord commanded that their judgment would come many, 2 centuries later. We'll talk about that. So again, this is somewhat repetition. So that's the end of verse 23, and then we'll get into a little bit more. But let me stop for a minute. Questions, comments, things on any of that? Okay, I'll keep going. Oh, okay, Scott, I'm sorry. I didn't see you.
No, I was just wondering whether there was any hostility or enmity that's carried over to modern day Israel about the North and the South from those old days. In other words, if you guys hadn't done that, we wouldn't have been in the shape that we were in or any of that kind of business. Is there any memory of that or any hostility within what we would now know as the state of Israel?
That's a good question. And it is almost 3,000 years ago. So it's for the religious Jewish person, not to speak for them, but that history is in their very DNA, I would say, but not against any individuals. It's more of a learning for them as a total people, because again, those northern kingdoms, those people, you've heard the phrase the lost tribes. I mean, they were dispersed by the Assyrians. So their culture didn't really continue. Other than what we'll read about in this next section coming up, there seems to have been this, again, synchronistic religion made up of non-Jewish people, but in the Jewish, Israel, the part of what would have been Israel back then. And so in Jesus's day, it's where we get some hints of it, and I didn't really study that in great depth. But so this is around 800 BC to the time of Jesus, around 30 AD. And in those 800 years, there was some developing culture, it'd be worth studying probably, of what then in Jesus' day was called the Samaritans, so similar to the term Samaria. And they were different, it seems, from what these people were. They somehow became closer to the Jewish faith, but different. And so they did something similar, but they didn't worship in Jerusalem. That was still difference. They focused more on the first 5 books, the Torah, versus the whole Old Testament. So there's these differences. And as you read in the Gospels, there was definitely animosity between the Jewish people of Jesus' day and the Samaritans. So it's probably worth some reading. I didn't look into that, but for today, I don't think it would be a hot issue. No, it's just too long ago. Be it like us being concerned about something that happened in England, before the Norman conquest. I mean, it's a long time ago. Let's see. Other questions? Yeah.
Were the Sumerians, were they the people that were imported in, or were they the original people that were scattered out that came back?
Great question. Let's just go to the text, and you'll get to see a little bit. But I think the short answer is they probably evolved over time, but they were people brought in. And then who knows if people from Judea moved up there, there's probably some intermingling, would be my speculation. Let's look. Okay, so verse 24 of chapter 17. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and brought them into the cities of Samaria in the place of the people of Israel. So what we just said, settled in the cities, and they didn't worship Yahweh. They didn't worship the Lord. So even though the people of Israel didn't do it right, they had idolatry, they had high places, they worshiped other gods. These new people didn't even have a synchronistic religion. They were just worshiping their God. So they brought their gods with them. And so this is kind of a funny statement. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So there seems to be this active nature, either from Yahweh or is interpreted from Yahweh or the Lord. And so they reported to the king saying, we got a lion problem. And the nations that you've carried away They don't know the law of the God of the land. And so remember in that day, there wasn't the great monotheistic religions that we have today or that understanding of one God. So there's this understanding, even if you're Assyria and you had, you thought the best gods, that there were local gods that had power in certain lands among certain people. So there'd be a religious respect. Well, you got to kind of honor these gods or it's going to go bad for us or for these new people. So what they did, verse 27, is the king said, this seems like a practical solution. Get one of those priests from the people we just dispersed and bring them back and let that priest kind of teach them how to worship the God of that land. So they did that. They bring in a priest and they say, well, this is how you worship the Lord. Now, remember, this is still not the way in Jerusalem they would worship the Lord, but I guess it was as close as they can get. But in verse 29, it says that the people still kept worshiping their God and these other gods in addition to however they were taught to worship Yahweh. So I won't go through all that, and they're still this burning their children in the fire. So again, don't know if that's symbolic or actual. If it's actual, it's pretty awful. So some type of human sacrifice. But in verse 32, they also worship the Lord. And so they had priests, again, not the priest appointed by Moses, but they had priests that then would help them know how to worship the Lord. And then to this day, so again, this was written maybe in the 6th century, we don't know for sure, but at least a couple of hundred years later. So to this day, so this would be the perspective of the people in Judea or the people in exile or some combination, that those northern kingdom people still don't get it right. They're still worshiping wrong. They don't do it the way God commands. Oops, sorry. And again, this is the Deuteronomistic perspective, that they're not doing what the Lord did in the covenant. So when God made a covenant, especially the 10 commandments about not worshiping other gods, verse 35, but to only worship the Lord. And tying it again to what God did for them, bringing them out of the land of Egypt, how God rescued them with great deliverance, that commands their loyalty or should command their loyalty. But again, they didn't do it. So it gets a little repetitive, but just a very important point. This is what happened after the exile. So Assyria has conquered Samaria, exiled most of the people, and now they're in this kind of influx relationship. So they're not really a continuation anymore of this covenant people in Israel, but they're people kind of halfway, not even halfway, partially trying to honor Yahweh. So again, this is written instructive for the people of Judah. Don't do what they did. Any comments on that? Questions or insights? Okay. So Israel is no more. And really, Judea then becomes the descendants of that covenant. And that's why Jewish people, even to this day, are called Jews from Judea. In the more modern era, the last 70 years, there's Israel again, but it's a definitely different, many, many centuries later understanding. So, and again, the way 2 Kings and all the books of the Kings are written, it's back and forth, back and forth. So in the back, at the time before the conquest, 3rd year of King Hoshea, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, begins to reign. He was 25 years old, 18 verse 2, when he began to reign. So again, Ahaz, really bad, unusually bad. Hezekiah, his son, is really good. So I'm not sure all the family dynamics that led to that. But he, again, Hezekiah does more than what other kings have done. He removes the high places, which the 4 good kings before Ahaz had not been willing to do. He broke down pillars, all the things that Ahaz had restored in terms of worship other than of Yahweh. Verse 4 is an interesting aside. Do you remember the story of the bronze serpent in Numbers, where all the people were getting bitten by snakes and Moses doesn't know what to do, and he asks God, and God says, create this bronze serpent statue. And when the people looked at that serpent, that statue, then they'll be healed from the stings. And then Jesus in the Gospel of John alludes to that. You probably remember hearing that story. It comes up, I think, every year. But just as the bronze serpent was lifted in the wilderness, so will the Son of Man be lifted up. So it's a key part. But in verse 4, what's interesting is that what was a God, inspired source of healing has become an idol. So you know how Yahweh worship, you're not supposed to have idols. But this serpent, which in the story had come from their time of exile, from the wandering in the wilderness, he actually breaks it apart, breaks it up as an idol, because the people of Israel had been making offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan, which is a play on the words of bronze and serpent. So he even broke something that was in the past something good that had become this type of idol. So any comments on that or questions?
What was the reference? The back reference was in what?
In Numbers,
In
and I wrote it down. Numbers chapter 21, verses 8 through 9. So Numbers 21, verses 8 through 9, and it's the story of the bronze serpent. Who remembers that story? It comes up pretty often. No? And then you can read chapter 3. So the famous John, Gospel of John, chapter 3, about for God so loved the world. If you read that whole chapter, there is a reference to the bronze serpent. So it's part of the history. So it's this interesting evolution. So even something that has been a source of healing can become an idol. So I think there's something worth considering in that. See a lot of pensive faces. All right. We'll keep going.
I'm thinking that the serpent also has a different characterization in Genesis. And then also I'm thinking of the artistry of the picture of Mary with her foot on the serpent. So you've got the serpent in Moses as being a symbol of healing, but you have the serpent in the garden being something evil. And that much later that Mary, I guess through her motherhood of Jesus, is conquering the evil of the serpent, which got us all into trouble way back in Genesis. So it's that's the pensive look I had. It was like serpent, good, bad, mainly bad, but okay, Moses had a good serpent.
Yeah, they're just for our understanding, very distinct stories. So even though there is a parallel that they're both about serpents, that these, during their time in the wilderness, because of disobedience, so this recurrent theme, in their disobedience, there was this judgment of serpents that came among them. It was biting them, poison serpents, that they were dying. And so when Moses prayed, the answer was to build this bronze serpent that then the people, by looking at it in faith, they have this sense of healing. The story in Genesis, of course, at the end, in the judgment of the woman in particular, about the serpent would strike her heel and she would crush its head. And so in art, that is often represented as a fulfillment of what would happen, like you said, through the birth of Jesus. So two different streams, but I don't know. I know my wife hates snakes, so I don't know if there's any theological reason. Now, I try to reason, well, it's good for the ecosystem. It's all part of what God's designed, and that doesn't seem to work. So anyway, we fight about what to do with snakes. All right, let's keep going. That was more of a curiosity thing, but it is, I think, a point worth considering. So in verse 5, Hezekiah trusted in the God of Israel. And he does it in a way that is almost is unique. And in this passage, that verb in Hebrew that is translated into English as trusted, that he really believes in Yahweh in this deep way, is not used in any other king before him, which is interesting. So even David, so that particular verb, that we in our faith put so much credence in, another way of saying faith, that he trusted. So he knew Yahweh or the Lord was going to be the protector, the one he can rely on. So that was also, and another, well, let me get to it and then I'll talk about it. He trusted in the Lord. Verse 6, he held fast to the Lord. So that's an image of intimacy, like holding on like a child to his parent or to a husband and wife, that there'd be this sense of clinging to one another because of this great love. And he held fast to the Lord. So his faith was something deeper. And the parallel in another king is Solomon. And that same verb is used. He held fast with his foreign wives. And that, if you remember the story of Solomon, is kind of where he gets off track, is he married many wives, including the daughters of kings of surrounding kingdoms. And they brought their worship, their way of worshiping different gods. And that took Solomon off track. So again, Hezekiah is, again, this example, even in some ways greater than David, who's usually our great example in these stories. The Lord, verse 7, the Lord was with him wherever he went, he prospered. And then this is an interesting, was this something that he overstepped his faith? It's interesting. He said he rebelled against the king of Assyria. So in his faith, perhaps, and his wanting to do what's right, perhaps he said, I don't need to worship or obey the king of Assyria. I will just worship Yahweh. And so he did, he no longer would pay the tribute. He attacked the Philistines, so that's in Gaza, again, still a territory we hear in the news today. Verse 9, in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of King Hoshea, so again, Samaria had not fallen, but I believe at this time he had been captured. The king of Assyria was going against Samaria, during this time of siege. And so there's an allusion to that, Samaria falls. In the 6th year, verse 10, in the 6th year of Hezekiah, which was the 9th year of King Hoshea, so right at the end, Samaria was taken. So we know that story, so they're repeating it for us. The king of Assyria carried the Israelites away. So again, we know that story because they didn't obey the Lord. So that's, again, a restatement of that. So in the 14th year, King Hezekiah and the king of Assyria came up against all the fortified cities of Judah. So again, Hezekiah, this very faithful king, really relies on, clings to God. And the king of Judah, Hezekiah, sends a messenger to the king of Assyria and says, maybe I was wrong. I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. So this way of, he has stopped paying his tribute. He sees now, especially perhaps after what happened to Samaria, that even with the Lord on his side, maybe the Lord doesn't want him taking on Assyria in this way. So the king of Assyria assesses a huge tribute in terms of what that would require, 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold, so a huge amount. And Hezekiah found them, gave all that he could find, kind of emptied the treasury of the king's house and the temple. Stripping gold, he's done everything he can. Verse 17, and this is an interesting, again, we'll go into a tactic they do. The king of Assyria sends some of his officials, basically, with this great army to Jerusalem. So this great show of force. And again, Jerusalem is a fortified city in a mountain. So they stand near the conduit of the upper pool, so where they would have gotten their water. And so they come out, and the king, so you have representatives from the king of Assyria, representatives from the king of Judah. They go out. So verse 19, say to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, on what do you base this confidence of yours? So, this is, again, what I said earlier. Assyria has this kind of psychological warfare that they do. You think that mere words or strategy or power or strategy and power for war, verse 20. So is that, your talk going to be enough against my great army? And then he really doesn't like that. He felt, and it's not clear that Hezekiah had done this, about relying on Egypt. Kind of an interesting turn of phrase in verse 21, that Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of anyone who leans on it. So it's like a staff in half, broken in half, and if you lean on it, it's going to go through your hand. And then verse 22, he attacks Hezekiah and Jerusalem's faith. verse 22, if you say to me, we rely on the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem. So in their spies, perhaps, their people within Judah, they know all these reforms that Hezekiah has done, and they're making a connection between the reforms that, again, Hezekiah has done to bring in a more Jerusalem and temple-centric worship, and says, instead, by doing that, you've alienated Yahweh. So he kind of confuses or says, if you're not doing the high places, you're not worshiping Yahweh as before. And then he really gets into pretty serious taunting. Again, this representative of the king of Assyria, I will give you 2,000 horses. So I'm going to give your army horses if you're able to put riders on them. So he's more or less saying, you don't have any people who are going to fight for you. Even if I give you horses, you aren't going to be able to have a cavalry. Verse 24, then how then can you repulse a single captain among the least of my master's servants? So you can't beat even one of my smallest groups of soldiers. And again, you can't rely on Egypt, shouldn't really rely on the Lord. You should just do what I say. And then he even implies that the king of Assyria is almost an agent of the Lord. And the Lord said to that king, go up against this land and destroy it. So again, that practice that through foreign powers that God seems to either speak or act, or at least those kings allege that. Now this is a kind of again, a human interest, almost funny, tragic, funny, verse 26, that Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, and Shebna, and Joah said to this representative of Assyria, please speak to your servants in the Aramaic language, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall. So Aramaic would have been like the lingua franca, the language everybody would speak, but the common people who would be at their post on the wall would not understand. So these leaders wanted them to speak leader to leader, but not letting all the people hear what they were more or less taunting them about. And instead, just do that. But again, the leader, the representative from the king of Assyria says, has my master sent me to speak these words to your master and to you, and not to the people sitting on the wall who are doomed with you to eat their own dung and drink their own urine? So again, it's part of that psychological warfare. And he continues his conversation. Verse 29, thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand. Do not let Hezekiah make you rely on the Lord by saying the Lord will surely deliver us, and this city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah. So again, he's speaking to the people trying to foment rebellion, dissension. So again, tactically, it makes a lot of sense. Don't rely on the Lord, so questioning their faith in the king and in God. Make your peace with me in verse 31. And then if you make peace with me, this is a phrase that's used in the prophetic literature as kind of a hoped for ideal. If you make your peace with me, then every one of you will eat from your own vine and your own fig tree. So have peace, have your own garden, your own farm, and drink water from your own cistern. That's what I promise. Then verse 32 is the rest of the deal. Until I come and take you away to a land like your own land. So you'll have peace, but then eventually, like your neighbors, your brothers in Samaria, you will be taken away. But where I'm taking you is a good place, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive oil and honey, that you may live and not die. So promising a good alternative, but in a different land. Do not listen to Hezekiah. So he keeps repeating that theme. And then he says, all these other lands that Assyria has conquered, remember that map I showed, those guys weren't able to help them. Basically, Yahweh or the Lord will not be able to help you. And then he points in the second half of verse 34, remember, Yahweh didn't help Samaria. So just keeping the focus on what's going to happen if they don't submit. So verse 36, this is hopeful, I think, and it helps in this situation. But the people were silent and answered this messenger not a word, for the king's command was, do not answer him. Then again, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, and who was in charge of the palace, and Shebna, the secretary, and all these people, they went to tell Hezekiah what was going on. And then we'll do at least part of chapter 19. We won't be able to do all of it. I'm just seeing, oops, Ron has to run. Okay. So let me stop sharing, and we'll do at least part of chapter 19 before we end today. So any thoughts or questions? This, to me at least, has a kind of a modern feel of what we still do in psychological warfare. Any observations? Scott, is your hand up new, or is that from before?
You know, I'm a little confused because in the beginning of that story there, Hezekiah says, okay, I made a mistake. And he tells him to give him all this gold and silver, and he does. But yet, here we are at the walls, and his guys are telling him they're going to besiege the city and kill everybody anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that just sort of a head fake, or what happened?
That's a good question. I think what Assyria did is they got everything they wanted, and they just defeated Samaria. So, this northern kingdom, so sister kingdom. And, once you've totally taken everything you can get, I'm assuming here, they just want the whole thing. So instead of the tribute, they want the actual fortified, they've taken some of the fortified cities already on the border. That's when he pays the tribute. By taking Jerusalem, that would be this huge prize strategically, as right on the border between Egypt and going into the empire of Assyria. They have, they're aiming for Egypt strategically. And so having total control would help them, I think. So I think they're, when you're paying tribute or you're paying ransom, that's good until the person wants more. Then you're kind of relying on their word. And I think they're saying, no, we want it all. So that's, I guess, the theory for not, don't negotiate with terrorists. Isn't that the saying? So it's a little tough. I know the big thing today with things like that is this whole ransomware deal, which is so crazy. That good news, I guess, is our Justice Department. I don't know if you read the story. They actually found this Bitcoin that we paid the bad guys. I forget which company.
Not all of it.
Not all of it, but at least some of it. So it's such a crazy world. Any other comments or questions?
I was kind of impressed with your having us notice the word for trusted in God being can't let go of, hold fast to. And that can be either a positive thing or a negative thing, as we saw between the two kings. You could be holding fast to your idols, or you can be holding to Yahweh and what Yahweh asked. And so for me, that kind of deepened the Deuteronomistic viewpoint, and for the first time actually had me see how that is translated in our own lives. Because up until now, it's like, do what Yahweh wants, do the ritual things, do the sacrificial things, do the dietary things. None of that means anything to me personally. But the distinction of trust, holding on to, trusting, all of a sudden made me think about what happens in our world. Who are the idols? What are the idols? What happens when we try to hold fast to our faith in God? Do they not taunt us and say, this is stupid and you're going to fail and you're going to fall flat on your face and you're a fool and all that other stuff? And so it was quite powerful to me just to think and meditate a little bit on the holding fast to. And what does that mean in our world? And what is the reaction that we get? And certainly in our society, we got a lot of idols. We don't have them up on the hill with the gold and the silver, but we got them. And how do they react when we pull away?
Yeah. Yeah, Hezekiah, as far as a king, you can't, he did everything that Yahweh wanted, right? He even brought down the high places that no other king had done before him. He trusted in God, as you said. And it's two different words, to be clear. So trust, that's used repeatedly. And then that image of clinging to or being so close to someone, hold fast was the phrase in English in our translation. So yes, So he's an example, I would say, for us as individuals, as leaders. But there seemed to be something, and that's where you have to meditate some more, was he overconfident? So he had such great faith. He said, well, I'm not going to continue this relationship with Assyria. Was that bold and faithful, or was it foolish? And could he have been faithful and kind of kept his head down and done what he needed to do for worshiping Yahweh, doing justice in his kingdom, and not rock the boat with Assyria? I don't know the answer, but I think it's the right question. Because what happens in chapter 19, we'll get into it maybe a little bit, but things do work out. So Assyria, after all that taunting at the wall, that king kind of gets his just desert. So it's not Yahweh intervened. So perhaps what Hezekiah was doing was not wrong in terms of taking on the king of Assyria. That's where.
Oh, I didn't know that, but that even kind of proves my thought process, that all God asks is that we hold fast. So how do we hold fast today? The
Right.
Jews, or the Israelites, they held fast by the laws that were given to them, that
Right.
sometimes seem strange to us. So we don't say, well, how do I hold fast? But I mean, is it not Bible study and regular prayer and discernment with community and all of those things that keep us holding fast to the God who calls us through community and through church? So, and when we try to do that and people respond, you're wasting your time or whatever, isn't that the same kind of voices that Hezekiah heard?
Right.
And so we can say, yeah, how fast did Hezekiah hold on to? What he did may not turn out well, right?
Yeah.
But in the end, you said, so I didn't know, but it did turn out well. So I'm thinking the story for the readers in that time was hold fast, stay close to community, but them, that's us. But for them, it was hold fast to all those rules. And God will see this as you're holding fast to God's spirit and God's direction and God's discernment. So isn't that what we do, but in a different way?
Yeah, I think those are all fair points. That Hezekiah had Isaiah in his board of advisors, and most of us know Isaiah is in some ways the greatest Hebrew prophet. And so if we ever read the book of Isaiah together, you'll see that. But in chapter 19, if you haven't read already, read ahead of chapter 19. And Isaiah gives him advice, basically saying, don't be afraid. God's got this. If you're the king and you're outnumbered, whatever the ratio was, probably, 100 to 1 or whatever, don't be afraid. And it works out. And even great powers are vulnerable to things beyond their control. So you can't, I don't think, you can't universalize all that we learned from Hezekiah, but you can universalize the questions. What is God calling us to do? Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, talks about worship, but especially the first few chapters talks about that worship is not enough. It's also how you treat the poor. You treat the widow and the orphan. Do you do justice as well as worship rightly? Don't get that part of it as clearly in 2 Kings, but it's there in the prophets. And definitely there in the Gospels. So we're right at 11. So I failed at getting us through 19. Sorry about that. But it's we're still aiming. Today's the 16th. We're still aiming to finish by the 30th. So next week and one more week, and then we'll take a summer break in July and summer all of August. So any final comments or questions? So read ahead if you want. So chapter 25 is the last chapter in 2 Kings. 19 is an important chapter, so we'll dwell there a little bit. We still have Josiah. We still have a really good king coming up, so we'll talk about him some. And then it ends, not to give away the ending, but I think with the end being Judah's defeat. So both Israel, or the northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom will be defeated by the end of 2 Kings. All right, we'll go in peace to love and